Can I welcome you to tonight's lecture, and a particular thank you to those people who were here on Friday when we had our previous seminar. So it's rather strange to have a seminar on a Friday and a Monday, but thank you for those who've actually come back again. For those of you who've been following this series on populism and science, this is coming to the end of the second term of the topic, which started at the beginning of Trinity. And the idea really was to take the theme of populism, which I have to say in May, people tended to be talking much more about populism and Brexit, populism and Trump. But those of you who were here at the beginning of the term will remember me saying how over the summer, we've had a variety of publications coming out, reports, a couple of books, and a series of articles in the press, which have highlighted what we were saying back in May, is that actually the educated, those who work in arts and culture, those who work in science, have been increasingly put into this group called elite, and therefore we are subject in many ways to the dynamics of populism. And those of you who've been before will remember that what we've tried to do with this series, and we're coming right to the end, we have our last one next week, is take the views of policymakers, of science communicators, of science journalists. We had Clive Cookson from the Financial Times last week, and of those people who work for science organizations. We've had some wonderful talks from the British Science Association and from some of the museums, both here and in London. But tonight, we're absolutely delighted that, if you like, the chief scientist who is involved in policy, Patrick Vallance, has agreed to come and talk to us. He is the government chief scientific advisor. He is head of the government science and engineering profession, and he is head of the government office of science. These tasks he took up last year. Before that, he was president of R&D at GlaxoSmithKline, where he'd been since 2012. But Patrick started as a doctor. He was a consultant physician in the NHS, having trained at St George's in London. And Patrick is a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and a fellow of the Royal Society. Before I invite him up to speak, I just wanted to set the scene for some of the things which have come out of this series, and I think which will provide a background to Patrick's talk on science mattering for policy. I quoted on Friday a bit from Nicholas's recent book called The Death of Expertise, and I just wanted to highlight one of the things that I think is particularly pertinent tonight. He talks a lot about not only the public rejecting science, but also others, themselves elites, politicians and policymakers who reject science. And he says, to reject the advice of experts is to assert autonomy and independence, but also to insulate public ecos from being told that they are wrong. And this relates very much to the Pew Conference, which met over the summer, and they talked about evidence and said evidence-based decision-making is threatened by growing political polarization, fractured media, and the acceleration of technological change. And I'm very much reminded by those of you who came last term to the talk by Roger Highfield from the Science Museum. And one of the things that Roger has written about is that if we are not careful in a world of populism, we will shift away from evidence-based policy making to policy-based evidence. And I know that, in fact, Patrick is very much going to be able, hopefully, to enlighten us about why that isn't happening and why it shouldn't happen. I have to say this is the second time I've introduced Patrick in the last year. I introduced him when I was director of the Royal Institution, and he gave the most fantastic Friday lecture. So I think we're in for a wonderful discussion tonight. So Patrick, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. And this question, why science matters for policy, is something that I obviously gave quite a lot of thought to before I swapped from being head of R&D for GlaxoSmithKline to becoming government chief scientific advisor in April of this year. And is something I thought about quite a lot since then as well. And about 3 weeks into the job, reading a newspaper that I don't usually read, I saw this headline. Bill Gates snubbed Donald Trump's White House job offer as not a good use of my time. But I think it's important to recognize this is not because Bill Gates thinks that science doesn't matter for policy. Okay, just to put it clear, there were other reasons why he thought it wasn't a good use of his time. So why, when we think about science, what are we actually thinking about? And I want to straight up say that the first thing to say is that science I'm taking as a broad definition of science, and this is from the Nurse Review, which led to the formation of UKRI, in which his definition of science is the very broad one, meaning knowledge. And therefore, in thinking about science mattering for policy, I think it's important to consider that this means all branches of science. It means definitely going beyond the physical laboratory sciences into social sciences. It also includes arts and humanities. The second point is that the scientific approach is important. And to echo actually some of the things that Sarah has just been saying, it's important when we think about the scientific approach in terms of informing policy that it has a respect for reliable and reproducible data, a skeptical approach which challenges orthodoxy and the researcher's own ideas, an abhorrence of the falsification of cherry-picking of data, and a commitment to the pursuit of truth. So this definition is rather helpful when thinking about why science matters for policy. And the evidence it does matter, I think, is becoming very clear. And you can see it from very important policymakers. And the one that struck me very clearly over the past year is a piece that Kofi Annan wrote in Nature just a few months before he died. And he was describing how the advent of data visualization and the ability for him to look at evidence in a way that was accessible to him and useful for what he was trying to do had completely changed his approach to thinking about both policy making and the assessment of policy impact. And what he wrote was, the results alone are astonishing, especially for me, an African accustomed to international headlines depicting a continent consumed by war, famine, and hunger. The African shown in these maps, which were maps of data visualization of everything from research through to economics, through to supply chains of food and other things, the Africa shown in these maps tells a different story, one of measurable, steady progress on issues long thought intractable. So there can be little doubt that when science is done properly, when science is presented properly, and when science is accessible to policymakers, it can make a difference. And there are many examples, of course, here in the UK. An example from the National Physical Laboratory at the top of this slide, showing particle number in the atmosphere and looking at the impact of policy change once it's been made. So this slide shows very high particulate matter in the environment, measured by NPL accurately, leading to a policy change, which was the introduction of low emission zones, remeasurement, and clearly the effect of the introduction of the low emission zones had an effect on particulate matter. And you can see that if you then follow it, it doesn't go down far enough. The emission zone is made more stringent, it falls further. A really good example of good science, going to policymaker, policy is made, and the effect of the policy is clearly measured. This, if you like, is an ideal situation where you can not only see science influencing policy, but actually measure whether the policy has had the effect you want. Other examples that I've been involved in since taking up the role is science was incredibly important in an emergency situation, in this case in the Novichok events in and around Salisbury and Amesbury, and there's no doubt that science was important in every aspect of that, and I'll come back to the every aspect part later on. But one of the key things was also the impact not only of the physical sciences, chemistry, but the impact of social sciences and others to think about behavior and the reaction that was going to take place to some of the events taking place in Salisbury. A recent report from the Government Office of Science on the future of the sea has been impactful not only in terms of public understanding and public perception, but also in terms of policy changes that are likely to take place because it's an accessible report. And an example of a complete tragedy of the Grenfell fire, where there is now, I think, a real imperative to ensure that the science that underpins planning, building safety, and the ability to make policy which keeps people safe, protected, and allows for the evidence to be used in the right way couldn't be more starkly demonstrated by what is an unbelievable human tragedy. So there can be little doubt that science, when done properly, when communicated properly, when presented in a way that's accessible, has an impact on policy, and policy can be measured against science. The example which is very live at the moment, of course, is around climate change and the recent IPCC report trying to limit the damage that we cause to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the UK, again, has responded, I think, to evidence. With the Climate Change Act of 2008, with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to 40% lower than since 1990, and by an increase in a very clear increase in the commitment to renewable energy. So there's no doubt that, again, policy, science presented properly can have a significant impact on policy. Is it enough? Well, this report tells us it's not enough, and therefore we need to do far more. But the report does so in a way that's very accessible and one that is difficult for people to say, I don't accept that I've got evidence. But there is a question underlying all of this, which is, if this is so easy, why is this such an issue now? And there are two reasons I want to pick up on as to why this is particularly important now. The first of those is that despite what I've just said, there is, as we know, a big movement around fake news, around the ability to say whatever you wish, about a distrust of experts. A survey in Canada over the last few years picked this up very starkly, where 70% of the population believed that science could give you any answer you wished it to give you, and therefore could be used to make any argument you wish to make. And 40% of the population believed that science is a matter of opinion. So we're in an era when actually the ability to challenge evidence on the basis of views rather than more evidence is one that's going to be an important counter to the rather logical explanation as to where science can matter in policy. The other key reason why this matters now, more than at any other time, is the quote from E.O. Wilson. We live in an era, we have Paleolithic emotions, not true in Oxford, of course, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And this imbalance between our various structures and the technology we have means that the ability to present the science clearly into government is crucial if we're going to get the regulation and the societal aspects of this right. So how does this actually work in the UK government? There is the Government Office for Science, which we've discussed, which I lead, which is a relatively small group of people, and I have an accountability as Government Chief Scientific Advisor to provide government into the Prime Minister and into the Cabinet. But of course, there's no way that small group can do the whole thing. Importantly, we are getting a network of Chief Scientific Advisors across as many departments as we can. There are currently 15 Chief Scientific Advisors. We're trying to get them into every department. And a change is that those CSAs should be the network of senior scientists across government, bringing an outside-in view bringing the challenge, bringing the ability to get scientific evidence into policy, and work as a team as well as individuals. And that's something which we're working very hard on at the moment, to try to get that team notion of chief scientific advisors in place. And other countries are looking at this model as well. Canada's gone down this model to some extent. New Zealand has. I was in Japan recently, they're interested in it. So other countries are picking up on this as a model for how they might get science advice into government. And of course, all we can do really is make sure that we are very well connected to advisory bodies, which includes groups like the Council for Science and Technology, which advises the Prime Minister, and to academia, and increasingly, I think, to scientists within the private sector and industry as well. So there's a reasonably good structure to do it in the UK government. And of course, at the end of the day, we're offering advice and we're putting evidence in front of people. We are not the decision makers. The decision makers are, of course, the politicians, but we can inform the policy. What do we do in terms of the areas? Well, the Government Office for Science covers, I think, 4 areas. Science for policy, which is the topic that we're discussing tonight, and as I've said, I think it's crucially important that we get that part right, because a lot else follows from that. It is a 2-part process. There is the evidence we can give and the ability of policy professionals to understand, absorb, and deal with the evidence we give. So there's little doubt that actually there is also something about the policy profession itself becoming more scientifically enabled to receive the advice. The science for resilience, which means giving advice in emergencies usually, which can be natural emergencies, floods, extreme weather, but it can also mean emergencies such as the Novichok example that I gave, and this is a key role of the Government Chief Scientific Advisor and the Government Office for Science, is to make sure that when COBRA meets the government-wide emergency response, the science advice into COBRA is clear, is a single view coming in, has been tested properly before it reaches that body. I'm going to touch on science for the economy later on, because so much of everything that we've talked about depends on being able to get the science working for the economy in a way that the economy can then provide funds for science. So science for the economy is critical. And the 4th one, which hasn't been there as an explicit aim until now, but I believe is crucial, is science for citizens. So at the end of the day, this science, whether it's through policy, whether it's because of safety, whether it's because of the economy, needs to benefit people. And individuals need to know how they interact with science. And I think this is an area which is going to become increasingly more important, not least because of the survey results that I told you from Canada, and I suspect maybe the same result if we did it in the UK. But also because citizens are increasingly involved in science, whether that is as participants, whether it's as users of science, for example, when we all go to the doctors or any other interaction where science is required, or because increasingly citizens can be part of the scientific process. And that's true whether it's professional scientists or as, for example, monitoring bee populations in the garden, or the example where online gamers were able to solve a crystal structure of an HIV protein in a few weeks, a problem that had taken academics 10 years not to solve. So these increasing examples where we have more and more people involved in the scientific process, and going back to the nurse definition, it's worth remembering that science is a process. And Ottoline Laser always says it's not the body of knowledge that's created, that is what's come from science. It is the process by which we answer questions which are important for us and important for society. So I'm keen to ensure that we keep throughout this the citizen at the heart of what we do. Let me give you 2 examples of one in policy and one on resilience, which illustrate to some extent this question of the breadth of science. So I'm not going to go into the details of this. This is a project that isn't published yet. It's on the future of mobility. And the question we're trying to address, and it's a foresight project, so it's a long project spreading over a couple of years, trying to gain all of the evidence around the science relating to mobility. As you might imagine, there's a lot of technical things that need to be looked at. There's a lot of work on automation. There's a lot of work on electric vehicles, on different forms of transport. But one of the really key findings of this report, one of the key things that's going to be part of the recommendation, is when you look at the options ahead of us, it's the behavior of all of us and the system in which this works which is going to be critical to success or failure. So here we're talking about demographic and circumstances, motivations, transport behavior, unconscious factors, transport environment. So to present science as a technical exercise out with the context of the environment in which it occurs and the behaviors which we will adopt as a result of the change, or the historical context in which this occurs, is doomed to failure in a policy setting. So consideration of science as a broad area that must incorporate these other areas of science is crucial if we're going to have impact. The second example of breadth that I want to give, and why bringing in social sciences, arts, humanities, anthropology, and other areas is critical, is one not from the UK, but from Japan. And this is following the nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And it's an estimate of the deaths that occurred following the nuclear disaster. So for most people, the worry, quite rightly, is around radiation. And the estimate of the number of deaths from radiation from that accident could be 400. The estimate of the deaths that occurred as a result of the evacuation process is thought to be 1,600. And this observation, and there are other examples as well like this, where the reaction to an event causes more harm than the event itself, is why in every single meeting of SAGE, which is the Scientific Advice for Government Emergencies, which is the group that brings together advice that feeds into COBRA, we have behavioral scientists in the meeting. Because the reflex of many of us may be to say, an event has happened, I must evacuate. The reflex of a behavioral scientist may be completely different to the one that I might have or somebody else might have. So this ability to marshal the breadth of science to try and tackle problems, whether it's a policy problem or whether it's, as in this case, a problem of an emergency, is critical. Another example of the breadth would be in the first outbreak of, not the first outbreak, but the big outbreak of Ebola before the current one. In fact, it was the burial practices of various groups which was causing quite a significant problem in terms of spread of the disease. There's no way that the virologist would know that was a problem. The anthropologist had to be the person to say, this is where the problem lies. So breadth of science in policy and for resilience, i.e. safety and national security, is crucial. If you think about the principles by which science needs to deliver policy advice, I think there are three that matter. The science advice needs to be relevant. In other words, it needs to be something that the policy owner should care about. It doesn't always mean that it has to be immediately relevant. In other words, there will be times when you're giving advice which will be relevant, and you just need to be sure it will be relevant at some point in the future. It needs to be excellent. In other words, it needs to be scientific advice. The worst possible thing that can happen is when a chief scientific advisor or a committee that's designed to give scientific advice gives an opinion based not on evidence, but on some other view that somebody has, and it needs to be delivered on time. And as an academic for 20 years before I went into GSK, I do know that one of the things we all have a tendency to do as an academic is say, well, I would be able to give you that answer, but really there's more research needed. And when somebody is trying to make a decision in the next month, or in the case of an emergency that day, the answer, more research is needed, is not very helpful. So it needs to be advice that can be acted on the basis of the current science today, notwithstanding that there may well be more research which has been identified as a result of the particular problem that one is trying to address. Let me just give you some examples of this. To try to get relevance, one of the things that has been done is to get the areas of research interest expressed. So this may seem incredibly obvious, but it's only really just happened. And that is to try to get policymakers in each of the departments across Whitehall to write down with the chief scientific advisor what are the areas where research is going to be important for you. What are the questions that you don't know the answer to that you'd like to know the answer to? Because that sets a framework then for not only what needs to be done within government, but also how one can engage with academia and other sources to try to answer some of these questions. So the areas of research interest, I think, have been an important way to try and get relevance established for research. Now, again, one of the big effects that these documents have had, and this is the first iteration, there's work to be done to get them into the right format, there's work to be done to get some consistency, there's work to be done to make sure they're updated on a regular basis. But one of the things these do is they force people to start to identify where the gaps are. I heard of a rather different approach to do this recently from a colleague in Japan who'd taken all of the submissions from each of the government departments into the equivalent of their treasury, and then used natural language processing to try and establish whether there were research questions hidden in there that hadn't been identified. And from that, he used the lever of the treasury to say, yes, you can get the money for the policy work you want to do next year, but you must embed research on these areas in order to try and improve the outcomes. So there are other ways to do this, but the areas of research interest form a key step to try to establish relevance. The second area of excellence I want to pick up in relation to evidence synthesis. So coming back to the point that very often when thinking about science into policy, it's not primary research usually, it's some sort of synthesis of the evidence base that's available. Sometimes that can be done very clearly and systematically in a meta-analysis, other times it can't, and it includes a mixture of meta-analysis approaches together with an assembly of the best available evidence which can't be amenable to meta-analysis. And a number of people, and I was one of the authors on this, published a paper earlier this year on what are the principles that one would use to try to get good evidence synthesis. And the principles are inclusive. In other words, you must involve the policymakers. It comes back to this point of relevance and considers many types and sources of evidence. It must be accessible. And I gave the example of Kofi Annan. It must be accessible. It must be written or accessible in a way where somebody can use it. It must be rigorous. There's no point giving work that actually doesn't stand the test. So however there are errors in it, because there are gaps in evidence, those need to be flagged up. But it needs to use the most comprehensive body of evidence you can get hold of, recognize the bias, and be independently reviewed, and it must be transparent. It must describe the methods. It must communicate the complexities and acknowledge the assumptions inherent. So excellence as a theme is critical if we're going to deliver scientific advice that matters. And the third is delivery on time. And this is important for the reasons I've said, and one of the reasons that we're moving now in the Government Office of Science from only or concentrating a large measure on foresight projects, which often take 2 years to pull together and provide a very comprehensive view of things, to also what we're calling foresight sprints, where we're doing shorter pieces of work, trying to get a look at some of the main issues, some of which will move into a much longer full foresight project, but some of them will be published as they are, as a shorter look at areas of importance, and, as I've said, to be able to deliver in a different way the advice that's needed, whether it's today, immediately, whether it's for the next month, or whether it's in the 6-month period, to get the advice delivered in a time that's ready and usable for government. So those three principles of relevance, excellence, and delivery on time are critical for science advice if it's going to matter for policy. Let me just come back to one area and just take a few moments to describe some issues in the UK around economy and science, the economy. There is a target for the government to increase the spend on R&D in the UK to try to get it to a level which is relevant or which is comparable to some other countries. So this is the current position. This is the percentage of GDP spent on R&D, and the UK is currently at about 1.7% of GDP. The OECD average is about 2.4%, and what you can see is very high-tech countries like South Korea and Israel are up towards 4%. The US is actually coming up to about 3% now, I think, and Germany is above 3% now. So the UK has a relatively low R&D spend as a percentage of GDP, and the government has said we want to get to 2.4% in the first instance and then get to 3%. So an ambition to increase R&D spend. And I just want to spend a few moments looking at this issue and saying, well, how would you think about that from a science perspective? Going back to Paul Nurse's review of actually science spending in the university sector and the public sector, the question always comes up, and this question used to come up to me when I was head of R&D at GSK, which is what's the right amount to spend on R&D? And nobody knows the answer. What we all know is that if the boundary is set too high, then there's a danger that resources are wasted and the quality of research supported is too low. And if the boundary is set too low, the research endeavour becomes inefficient and dysfunctional, with funding decisions behaving more like a lottery. So we know that there must be a right amount, we just don't know what it is. If you look at this question of GDP spend, and I don't want to go into the details, but if you look at the question of the GDP spend, there's not much evidence to suggest 2.4% is some magic number, but actually it does turn out that if you plot the GDP spend against productivity, so GDP spend on R&D against productivity, it does sort of come out at around 2.4% from the one bit of data that's there. So there's some reasonable evidence that it's not a crazy number to go for, and the other support is, of course, is the average of the OECD. So it's not an unreasonable number. We've got no idea whether this curve goes like this at the end or whether it continues to go up. We just don't know. But we can, I think, assume that 1.7% is too low. Now, what do we do with our 1.7%? Well, actually, we do really rather well in terms of academic research. There's no doubt we have a world-leading position. We've got 1% of the world's population, and we've got 16% of the world's most highly cited articles. And actually, if you look at the research output by published papers, we do extremely well compared to the rest of the world, and we're probably number 1 or 2 if you adjust for population size and spend. So we're effective at giving good, high-quality, world-class academic research. If you ask a different question, which is how good are we at turning that into economic benefit and measuring the innovation output of what we do, we're not bad at that either. So depending on which measure you use, we rank reasonably high up the innovation index that people measure. But if you look at both the research output, the academic research output, and the innovation score as a ratio, so you're now looking at what's been called innovation efficiency, we drop to rank 20 out of 127. Because our innovation is not as good as our fundamental research, even though it's pretty good. So if we're thinking about where there's an opportunity to do better, there's no doubt that innovation is one of them. But if we're thinking about where we absolutely mustn't lose ground, it's in fundamental research, it's in the ability to support investigator-led research, it's the ability to support ideas coming up through academia. Is it possible to increase the spend? Well, the first thing to say is it's absolutely not possible to do it from public funds. So nobody aims to get there simply by spending more public money. You have to spend some more public money to do that, and the government's committed to do that. But if you look at the countries which have increased their R&D spend as a percentage of GDP, and there's an important thing to notice here, they have all increased their R&D spend as a percentage of GDP, but not by trashing GDP. Okay, it's a true increase in R&D spend, because that's the other way you can change the percentage. Not a good idea. They've done it by increasing the input from business. So it's attracting more inward business investment. So that's Korea. So the business investment's in blue. The increase in spend from government is in green. And the increase in spend in light blue is from abroad or not-for-profit. So nearly every country that's managed to increase its R&D spend has done so through increasing business R&D spend as well as public investment. And then if you ask the question, well, how might we do that? Well, what is it that makes businesses want to invest in their R&D in a country? You won't be able to read this, but the answer is access to specialist knowledge. We're pretty good at that. High availability of researchers. We're pretty good at that. That's obviously been highly dependent upon mobility of researchers. We are very dependent upon the international nature of our research base. And then things like the regulatory environment and access to markets. But clearly, right up there is the ability to access knowledge, availability of researchers, and the ability to get the finance right for startup companies and growth companies. So we ought to be able to do this with the right series of incentives. And we need to recognize two other points, which is if this is the ownership of businesses who perform R&D in the UK. So this is 1993 to 2015. Yellow is UK owned and blue is foreign owned. It's very clear that we've got an increased percentage of foreign owned companies, and the percentage of business R&D funded from abroad is going up. We need to continue to get that. So we're going to have to attract businesses here in order to meet this target of 2.4%. So my messages on this are that, one, the fundamental academic base is critical, it must be protected, and we must make sure that Blue Skies research is the foundation. If you like, that's the goose that lays the golden egg. We must be clear that we have to get more business investment, and therefore the incentives for that need to be right. And part of that is the way in which we train and develop people. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're going to need to attract investment from overseas. The final point I would like to make on this is that the ability to look at R&D across our economy requires us to understand that 80% of our economy is the service sector, and therefore R&D in the service sector is critically important as part of achieving this. I've said it in the previous slide, and I'll repeat it. Whatever we do, whether it's to try to get science into government, whether it's to try to get policy professionals to be more able to receive scientific advice and do something useful with it, whether it's our ability to do science for the economy, this is about the people we train, the environment we have, and the ability to have a truly international approach to science if we're going to be successful in driving a science-based policy and a science-based economy. And in putting this slide up and thinking about people, I thought I would just give you in one slide a snapshot of what's happened to me in my career. So this is trusted or valued sources of information on science. And about 13 years ago, I was a scientist working at UCL. I was head of Department of Medicine at UCL. So I was nearly as valued as television as a source of information on science. And I went overnight to become head of discovery at GlaxoSmithKline. So I fell down here, and I dropped one place on becoming a scientist working for government, and I'm now just above a religious organization as a valued source of information. So you will take everything I've said with a huge pinch of salt, I'm sure. Thank you very much for your attention.
take oversight of what goes on. We now have about 15 minutes for questions, and can I just remind you that we are, this is all being videoed, so if you do not want to be on the video, please do not ask a question, because we cannot edit you out. We have a microphone, so if you could just raise your hands, and in fact, please 2 or 3 people at a time, because then we can order you, and then the microphone will come to you, and we're going to go to Tim at the back, and then that man, and then this lady.
Hi, Tim Palmer from Physics here. Your anecdote about the academic to whom you went for advice, not maybe you, but government goes to advice, and he or she says more research is needed, and your reaction is that's not good enough, rather touches a raw nerve with me, because... I didn't say that to you, did I? No, yeah. But the response more research is needed is code for saying there's a lot of uncertainty in what I currently know. And uncertainty, after all, is the hallmark. I mean, Richard Feynman, the great theoretical physicist, said it's the defining characteristic of science, that it's fundamentally uncertain. And the trouble is, when you get pressure from policymakers, let's say, I think even more media, it's very easy to gloss over that uncertainty, and then, therefore, you end up giving advice which is actually not very useful. Or maybe you say, well, I'll just give the person the most likely outcome, you know, the mode of the distribution, when actually the decision might well be, the right decision may be lying in the tail of what you think is going to happen. And I actually think, if I just carry on for 1 second, that when experts come on to the media and say it will be X, Y, and Z, I think quite often the public can smell a rat, actually, and a lot of the distrust of experts comes from people being overconfident about what they think. So you didn't really address that issue of, I would personally have uncertainty as a big box or big circle or something, because it's crucial to good decision-making, but it's very difficult to know how to communicate that to people who are not experts in the field. So just...
Well, maybe can I deal with that one?
Yes.
Sorry. I think you're absolutely right, Tim. And the point about my second principle, which was excellence, is exactly that. It's not excellent advice to say the answer's this. It's never this. There is a range of possibilities. That's true in an emergency situation. It's true in policy. And therefore, excellent scientific advice, and it's enshrined in those 4 principles that I put up about evidence synthesis, is that you must be able to lay out the uncertainties and the assumptions underlying the advice. And so I think it's okay, and it's the right thing to do, to say to a policymaker, the levels of uncertainty are so broad, I cannot give you anything that is useful advice on the basis of current evidence. That's fine. But the reflex to just say, I don't know, more research is needed, is just not going to be received well. To lay out uncertainty clearly, I think, is well received, and I know it's well received in the emergency situation, and I believe it's well received in the policy arena as well. And that, I think, is captured under excellence of science.
Okay, and
hello, Martin Gibson from Earthly Games Limited. Thank you, very elucidating talk there. You mentioned a couple of times the policy profession. I've been lucky enough to work with lots of policymakers, and I find they're very bright people and very driven and very ethical. Yes. But I question you on whether it's a profession. I expect professions to have standards and codes of conduct and things, and to be, you know, measured against their peers. Could you just elucidate a bit more on that, please?
Yes, I may have fallen very rapidly in 6 months into Whitehall speak. There is such a thing as the policy profession across Whitehall. There is a leader of the policy profession, and people in the policy profession do indeed work towards getting standards of training and knowledge and things that they should know in order to do that. So you're absolutely right as well, that I think my experience anyway is that the people in policy in Whitehall are extremely bright, they're extremely well motivated and extremely hard working, and I think that's a really important starting point for this. One of the criteria for the policy profession is to actually, that they've got one of the requirements is that they learn about science, which I think is a great move, actually.
Hi, I'm Michaela Bunekova, and I'm a student here at university doing comparative social policy. I was just wondering, you were talking about research and development, and let's say it successfully translates into social policy and policy in general. how does science relate to policy transfers to other countries after?
You mean how do we help with transfer of that policy into other countries?
Into other countries.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not so if you take something like the Future of the Sea report, it's not just about the UK. It's actually a report which deals with policies which are global policies, and therefore there are recommendations for other countries and indeed the globe in that. There is some formal link, so I'd say we're much closer to talking about policy changes with Canada, New Zealand, Australia to some extent, than some other places, but certainly some European countries. I don't think there is a formal mechanism for how we in Go Science actually pick up on a UK successful policy and use the science to do that abroad. It's an interesting question, and I haven't got an answer to that.
Cameron Hepburn, thanks Patrick, great talk. Quick question, so was Bill Gates right? Or to put it another way, where should scientists direct their truths in a post-truth world?
Well, I think Bill Gates is a busy man, and he may have all sorts of reason to think it wasn't a good use of his time. If you ask a different question, which is should a scientist get appointed to advise governments, I think the answer is yes, and the US is doing that now, and I think a very strong scientist is being recruited, is going through the approval process in Congress to be appointed to that role. And I think it is a critical role, actually. And I think it's quite interesting. In the last few months, I've been to several countries. The reaction you get from people. Actually, I'll take a step back. I'll give you a reaction I've had within Whitehall. So one of the things that I did very early on was to go and meet with all of the permanent secretaries in each of the departments. And occasionally, a response went something along the lines of, "Thank you for coming to see me, but we don't have any chemists in this department. We're not a scientific department." That was by far the exception. So I said, "Well, I understand you haven't got any chemists, but have you got any problems?" To which the answer is, "Yeah, loads of problems." "Okay, well, how can science help you?" And I have to say, everyone's been extremely receptive to that. So, okay, well, now you're talking, how can we get science into this? And so I think that is the framework. And when I go to other countries, it's interesting that those countries that have adopted the same system as us are very happy with it. Some countries don't instantly see why actually having science inside government helping, bringing the outside in is helpful. And one of the ways that I think it unlocks it to some extent is scientific advice for emergencies, actually, where suddenly this swings into action and people can see exactly where it adds value in an immediate setting. So I think that's an area where you can immediately see the benefits of science, whereas the policy bit takes a bit longer.
Me? Yeah, hello. Miles Allen, Oxford Martin School. But I'm actually asking this question as a dad of a daughter who's just finished a history degree and a son who's about to embark on a physics degree. And if I was a betting man, I think I'd know which one I'd put more money on becoming Prime Minister. What are we, in the long term, going to do about the fact that so many of the journalists, policymakers and so forth we deal with have had to give up science at age 15 or 14, just because that's the way our education system works?
That's a big question. If you're asking my view on that, I think that we give up science far too early, and I think we put people off science, and I'm really quoting Ottilie Laser here in her view, which I share, which is science has become associated with being a hard, difficult subject with lots of facts. And that puts some people off. And the truth is that science is not that body of knowledge. Science is actually the method. And it's the method of asking and framing a question, doing an experiment to see whether that is right or wrong, and interpreting your answer appropriately with all the caveats that Tim said about the uncertainty around the result you've got. So that in everyday life, people use science the whole time, whether it's the person who chooses to try out 3 different ways of going to work to find out which is the nicest and most convenient and takes the least time, or whether it's the child who's exploring the natural world around them, they experiment, and then they react accordingly. So I think that there's a bit of reframing of science in schools which is really urgently needed to stop it being only perceived as a factual subject about learning more and more information, which, by the way, it's totally impossible to learn these days because there's too much of it.
You have a question?
Hi, Tom Nicholas, physics PhD student. So you've given several examples of how the public have distrust of science in Canada and the UK, and I think we all know that there are certain issues in which, like, the average public opinion differs a long way from the reality. My question is, do you think that someone in your position and people who work just below you in, like, public-facing roles have a responsibility to publicly espouse positions which they know will be seen as very unpopular if they think the evidence points to that? Or do you think your role is more one to provide, like, advice within closed meetings in Whitehall?
Well, my advice is definitely to give the evidence as the science presents it. So I think it's the third slide that was definition of science, being challenging, being unafraid to speak truth to power, being prepared to give the unpopular view, because that's where the science comes from, is absolutely part of this role. It's part of every chief scientific advisor's role, and actually it's what the civil service, politicians and others value. So the head of the new cabinet secretary, Mark Sedwell, spoke to the chief scientific advisors. I pulled us all together for a meeting a couple of months ago, and he said, I think really of you as licensed dissidents in government, which I thought was a really nice description actually of what we're there to do, which is to bring that in. Now, your second point is, should we go public on that? The answer is that we should do what we need to do to get the evidence heard. Now, if every time I'm giving evidence I decide I'm going to go public first, that's really not helpful to getting things done. If there's something which requires a CSA to go public on it, a CSA should go public on it. But you do that every day, and quite reasonably, people are saying, well, why are you doing that? We haven't even had a chance to think about this yet. So I think it's about being very clear about the evidence, about never backing away from what the evidence tells you, with the caveats of uncertainty, and being prepared to speak your mind on it.
Hi, you spoke at the beginning of your talk about how populism and distrust of elites was a problem today. Oh, you spoke at the beginning.
Yeah.
And anyway, at the end of your talk, you then talk about how you're going to grow the economy through increases in R&D spending, and looking at that increase, it's likely that a lot of the jobs are going to be high-value, highly skilled jobs, which are not going to help the people that already distrust the elites and the scientists. So I just wonder how science can bring value and how you communicate that to the people who really distrust it.
Well, it's a fantastic question. Of course, to some extent, it was exactly the question that occurred at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Are we going to benefit from all this that's happening? And I think the absolute political challenge in this, and the one that is a societal challenge, is as the nature of technology and science impacts society, how do we ensure that's done in a way that actually creates more distribution of wealth rather than actually concentration and elitism? And so I think it's an assumption that you've made that science necessarily drives in that direction. I don't think that's the case at all. I think there'll be many examples, and I'll give you one from health. If you start to use technologies in health and you think that you can replace human contact with the technology alone, it's a big mistake. If you look at the technologies in health and say that actually provides more time for the human interaction, which is a fundamental part of what people need when they're at their most vulnerable, that is a different way of looking at it. And so I think that's precisely why the E.O. Wilson quote is so important, that the use of our technologies needs to be tied to what is required in terms of the societal need for human contact, and indeed for jobs and prosperity to be shared in a way that's accessible. So I don't actually accept the premise that this inevitably drives to division.
one of the discussions that we had in a previous lecture was around the fact that the public is becoming much, much more aware of the funding of science, that taxes fund science, although you showed quite strikingly that to go forward we have to have alternative funding models. And quite often if the public are asked what should be funded, what is important, it can be something that actually scientists believe is not particularly of interest to their particular research, or it can be something that the government feels maybe for all sorts of reasons isn't something that is important. And there was some kind of a discussion about how do we balance as we move into this world where increasingly we have the public involved in all sorts of decisions that maybe in the past they weren't involved. How do we prioritize what is looked at? I mean, you do these foresights and you make a decision, but how much does this come from what the public feels or what the government wants or what the scientists want?
Well, I want to answer that in a slightly different way, which is I talked about the success of pure academic research in the UK and the need to protect that. I think that we need to be explicit that that is work which we protect, and it's nobody else's business as to where curiosity-driven research goes. It's absolutely all of our business to say how much we want to spend on that. So if we chose as a society to spend 100% on that and nothing on application and development, personally, I think that would be a huge mistake. If we chose to spend 100% on the application, the development, and the implementation of the science we've got today, on nothing on blue skies research, I think we're doing future generations a huge disservice and we're disabling our intellectual might and our economy. So I think we've got to be a bit more explicit about what we want to spend in those different buckets. We need to be explicit about the amount we choose to spend on blue skies, the amount we choose to spend on what I'm going to call development, so the ability to turn that into something practical, not necessarily turn that into something practical, but turn a knowledge into a practical thing, and the amount we're prepared to spend on businesses in order to make sure that businesses are equipped to be able to utilise and contribute to the scientific effort. And, the US is quite good actually at spending money in businesses on their science through various grant mechanisms. And I think we've got various mechanisms in this country to do so. So I think actually to have the honest debate with the electorate, it's that debate rather than the idea that you would debate, for example, somebody wanting to look at a three-dimensional structure of a compound that nobody else has ever heard of, and that you're going to get views from lots of people as to whether that's an interesting or not interesting thing to do. You won't, but you could at least say which bucket that falls into.
Right. And I think we just have one last question, and this man over here put his hand up slightly before everyone else, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Matthias Rossum. I'm a postdoc at the physics department. I have a comment and a question. First of all, the fit on that plot of GDP spending and productivity is pretty bad. So if you want to increase your funding and spending, you might spend some time figuring out how to correlate those two things better. That was meant to be funny, sorry.
Secondly, you mean the thing that I would caveat as being the only evidence there is on where you end up and the right amount to spend, which is not good.
Secondly, so you mentioned that the service industry represents about 80% of the British economy. I suppose that also includes financial things as well. There was an interesting article in The Guardian last month how the financial industry produces quite a bit of wealth for the UK, but it actually subtracts intelligent people from the rest of the country. How much effort is there put into sort of leveling the playing field in terms of, you want blue sky research, but as a postdoc I get paid the same as a bus driver. So if someone were to say, we'll pay you 3 times as much money to go in and figure out how to move money around a bit, how do you sort of level the playing field in that way?
How can I possibly have an answer to that? I don't know the answer to that question, but of course it's true that there is the value put on different jobs isn't the same value that we'd all put on different jobs.
Okay, well sadly we have to come to a halt here. Next week, and it is on a Wednesday, so it's next Wednesday, we are leaping around a bit, we're going to have Professor Jennifer Rubin, who is the Executive Director of the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, who is going to be in many ways picking up some of the themes that come out of Patrick's talk and talking about effectively supporting and facilitating high-quality science. But can we thank Patrick?
Terrific, by the way. Absolutely
yes.
terrific.
Thank you. But can we thank Patrick for a fascinating insight? Questions if people just wanted to come up for a few minutes. So.